Number 14, S-222.
Thank you, Your Honor. Honourable Senators, I move that Bill S-222 to expand voting rights in Canada be now read for a second time.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator McPhedran, seconded by the Honourable Senator Sorensen, that this bill be read a second time. On debate, Senator McPhedran.
Thank you again, Your Honour. Colleagues, I will begin in French.
As a senator from Manitoba, I recognize that I live on the territory of Treaty 1, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. I thank all the senators who spoke to debate expanding voting rights, whether they were in favor or against that measure. A rich and open debate can only enrich the Senate's deliberations on any issue brought before our chamber. I am particularly proud and deeply grateful to my colleagues in the Senate who, during the debate on a previous version of this bill, in the final days of the 43rd legislature in 2017, recognized its potential and voted to refer it back to committee for further study. This was the first bill to pass second reading in the House of Commons or in the Senate. Whether or not they agreed with expanding the right to vote, a majority recognized the importance of entrusting a committee with the task of studying and evaluating the merits of this bill. This was a clear signal of two things. First, that we recognize and respect the importance of young people in our democracy, that their increased involvement in the electoral process deserves our sincere study and attention. And secondly, that we honor our duty as elected officials to take issues of national importance seriously. As many of you know, when I arrived in this chamber, I established a youth advisory committee. In 2017, my first strategic plan, which was developed with a diverse group of young leaders, also included young Francophones who made expanding voting rights their top priority. In fact, the first national youth organization in Canada to focus on the benefits of voting for 16 and 17-year-olds was the Federation of French Canadian Youth. More than 20 years ago, youth lead the vote 16 to this day. I recognize that there are diverse opinions on the issue, but I do hope you will agree that as senators, we must first and foremost examine the legislative proposals presented to us. There is a wealth of evidence in favor of raising the voting age, of lowering the voting age, rather, and I refer all senators to our website, vote16.ca, where you can find our collection of Senate speeches and a comprehensive review of the evidence, including data, empirical university research, documented cultural and social benefits, and decades of proven experience from pioneering countries such as Austria, Scotland, Brazil, which now number 17. Since I introduced this bill 7 years ago, the evidence, academic studies, and concrete proof of its benefits have only grown. To summarize the evidence for expanding the right to vote in democracy, nothing bad happens.
Allow me to repeat in English. The summation of research-based evidence on impacts on democracies when voting rights are expanded to include 16 and 17-year-olds is nothing bad happens. Since the introduction of my first Vote 16 bill, the worldwide trend of expanding voting rights has continued to grow. Relevant to the Canadian context is the recent unprecedented announcement by the government of the United Kingdom, 70 million people in 4 countries, that 16 and 17-year-olds will be voting in their next election. Prime Minister Starmer said at the time, if you can work, if you can pay tax, if you can serve in your armed forces, then you ought to be able to vote. The UK Prime Minister is not alone, and this is for my dear Conservative colleagues. UK Conservative, the Right Honourable Damien Green, has noted, quote, the traditional Conservative response to the idea of giving 16-year-olds the vote has been to reject it, on the ground that they are not mature enough, they don't pay taxes, and therefore they don't feel the consequences of any vote they may cast. The traditional response needs further thought, end of quote. He makes the case that Conservative support would show, quote, that we were confident of taking our arguments to a new generation. We could introduce them not only to the good habit of voting in elections, but to the even better habit of voting Conservative, end of quote. He is joined by another Conservative voice. Ruth Davidson, former leader of the Scottish Conservatives, has said, quote, having watched and debated in front of 16 and 17-year-olds throughout the referendum, my position has changed. We deem 16-year-olds adult enough to join the army, to have sex, get married, leave home, and work full-time. The evidence of the referendum suggests that, clearly, they are old enough to vote too, end of quote. While Vote 16 has already been adopted in many countries, the UK reform is of particular interest to us here in Canada. First, our entire democratic system in Canada is based on the UK's Westminster model of government. Indeed, to this day, we continue to share a common head of state. Second, the UK has 70 million voters, making this one of the largest examples of an expanded voting age in the world. Third, 50 years ago, the UK extended voting rights to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, and Canada followed soon thereafter. The core argument in favor of this bill is quite simple and straightforward. We should extend the voting age to 16 because the overwhelming evidence verifies that 16 and 17-year-old Canadians are more than sufficiently mature, informed, and ready to exercise the right to vote in federal elections, commensurate to the ability displayed by those aged 18 and older. Extending the voting age will increase voter turnout by providing young people the opportunity to vote for the first time in an environment supported by their schools and their families. Additionally, we know that those who vote at an earlier age for the first time are more likely to vote on into the future. It's lamentably ironic that polling stations are often located in high schools, even as most students must watch from afar as others exercise their right to vote. These are not anecdotal affirmations. We know these facts because an ever-growing body of quantifiable research, mostly in Europe, confirms it. But not for long. I'm excited to invite you to 2 academic roundtables on democratic resilience here in the Senate. On November 5th, Indigenous scholars and students will explore what research needs to be done in Canada on democratic resilience, and on November 19th, they will join other Canadian colleagues to further this inquiry in a Canadian context. Colleagues, knowing that this is a debate new to many of you, I'd like to address several questions and objections raised over the years, many of them procedural rather than substantive. In doing so, I hope to demonstrate the legitimacy of this bill and the vital role the Senate can and should play by referring it to committee for comprehensive study. Voting age has changed over time as convention and societal norms have evolved. It should not be conflated with the age of majority, as had been argued here by some senators, if for no other reason than the age of majority itself is not consistent across Canada, being 18 years in 6 provinces and 19 years in the other 4 provinces and 3 territories, but 18 years federally. There are numerous rights and legal privileges afforded to young Canadians that are not at all linked to majority age, such as driving, work, military service, or medical and sexual consent. These age-based responsibilities are grounded on task-specific maturity, responsibility, and ability to form analytically sound, independent decisions. Voting capacity aligns with this science. It is scientific fact that the neurocognitive development required to make reasoned decisions is as fully developed in a person of 16 years as in a person over 18. Dr. Sarah Jane Blakemore, a neuroscientist and professor at Cambridge, writes, quote, "They can weigh arguments, think abstractly, and consider long-term consequences. This type of careful, deliberate thinking used in calm situations is called cold cognition. It is the kind of decision-making typically involved in voting," end of quote. Another senator once contended that, quote, "common sense," quote, "should tell us not to continue this debate." Well, I submit it's exactly common sense that says we must. We know young people can reason just as clearly and logically as adults, the science of cold cognition. Then common sense demands we study whether extending voting rights is right for these times. Another senator asked us to contemplate the proper age of wisdom to be qualified to vote. I grant it's a beautiful question, but irrelevant. Wisdom may denote sense and judgment, which often deepens with age and experience, but wisdom is not a prerequisite for any voter. We all know many Canadians, young and old, who choose to be informed, engaged, and involved in their communities, to stay up to date on political events, and who thoughtfully formulate their own policy preferences and positions. But let's be honest. We also know many others who choose not to be. The lower voter turnout data across Canada attest to this disengagement. However, we do not limit voting to those who can prove a certain level of engagement or knowledge. In fact, wisdom is in knowing that doing so is fundamentally wrong. There is no pre-screening knowledge test to qualify a voter. We simply use an arbitrary minimum age at which we agree individuals can carry the weight of informed decision-making. For the past half-century, this has been at 18 years. This age was previously 21 years, and before that, 25 years. Not so long ago in our history, women and Indigenous people were denied the vote, essentially deemed incompetent, echoed in many arguments against 16 and 17-year-olds today. Consider, All political parties welcome 14-year-olds as fully capable to serve as voting delegates, entrusting them with full rights to make reasoned and informed voting decisions on their selection of Member of Parliament candidates and even a potential future Prime Minister. But on the other hand, think them incapable of voting during a national general election. Senators, perhaps these issues are exactly why this bill merits careful scrutiny by a Senate committee. I want to address another counterpoint raised in this chamber, that if we deign young Canadians ready to vote at 16, we should also lower all other age-based restrictions, such as drinking. Science notes how cold cognition differs in neurological function and development from hot cognition, which is more entwined with emotion as motivation. This aspect of neurological development takes longer to mature because, unlike cold cognition, it is heavily affected by ongoing hormonal and physiological growth. That is why Canada permits driving at 16 years, but restricts drinking and legalized drug consumption, which target emotional processes and physical control to 18 or 19 years. In the US, this is even more pronounced. You can join the Army at 17, vote at 18, but only drink at 21. We already distinguish between these capacities in law, and voting clearly belongs with reasoning, not with drinking. Medical research shows the higher the drinking age, the better the health outcomes. But the voting research shows the reverse. The lower the voting age, the stronger the democratic outcomes. Studies across Europe show that extending the voting age increases turnout, builds lifelong voting habits, and even encourages older generations to re-engage with democracy. As I often say, vote young, vote long. In debate on my bill S-201, Senator Plett, as critic, raised points that bear repeating because I agree with him. He acknowledged that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms enshrines voting rights to Canadians and does not specify an age, to the point where we must no longer ask, why should we extend the voting age, but rather, why should we not? Indeed, young Canadians have brought a charter challenge, arguing that the current voting age is in violation of Sections 3 and 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and is therefore unconstitutional. A 2022 landmark decision of the Supreme Court of New Zealand held that their current voting age of 18 was a discriminatory, unjustified limitation on the rights enshrined in their Bill of Rights. Note that the drafters of the New Zealand bill studied Canadian rights model in the development of their own. As critic of a previous Vote 16 bill, Senator Plett cited the Lortie Commission of 1991, mandated to examine national voting age. Youth and adult engagement were compared in 3 areas. 1, the extent to which those to be enfranchised had a stake in the governance of society. 2, the extent to which they could be expected to exercise a mature and informed vote. 3, the level of participation in activities of citizenship. On all 3 criteria, the Commission found youth on par with adults. Senator Plett relied on the Commission not reaching consensus on extending the voting age. However, he omitted important findings and recommendations made by that Royal Commission. From page 57 of the report, since Confederation, the franchise has undergone regular change to include an ever-increasing number of Canadians. As our society continues to evolve, it is possible that a lower voting age will become the focus of stronger demands by those concerned and greater support on the part of Canadians. The voting age is not specified in the Constitution and is therefore relatively easy to change. We therefore conclude that Parliament should revisit the issue periodically." End of quote. has been more than 50 years since Parliament last seriously revisited this issue. In that half-century, science and neuroscience have vastly deepened our understanding of youth maturity, reasoning, and comprehension. In that 50-year time span, young Canadians have been asked to take on more responsibility, become more politically aware, more engaged, and more directly affected by decisions to which they have little or no input. A range of global and Canadian studies have found that 16 and 17-year-olds are not less politically developed than adults. In some cases, they are more knowledgeable or as knowledgeable as adults. Similarly, Elections Canada has found that those aged 16 to 17 are just as interested, sometimes more, in participating in various forms of political activity than older voters, including for both voting and non-electoral civic activities. In the past 5 decades, around the world, countries have recognized this reality, extending voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds and seeing tangible benefits. Higher youth participation, stronger civic habits, and greater engagement across all generations. This year alone, 3 cities in the United States have extended the voting age to 16. We have international research and resources now that strengthen our options for revitalizing our democracy. I'm especially encouraged by the Democracy Classroom Network's roadmap to Votes at 16, which sets out 16 steps to ensure lowering the voting age, quote, becomes a transformative step for UK democracy, end of quote, including a guaranteed entitlement to democratic education, strong support for educators, and expanded opportunities for youth leadership and influence. Backed by toolkits on tackling social media misinformation, understanding echo chambers, and making civic dialogue engaging, this work comes as the UK government prepares to table its youth strategy and curriculum and assessment review, decisions that will shape national youth engagement. With Canada and the UK bound by a shared crown and constitutional heritage, their leadership reflects a global shift worthy of this chamber's consideration. There are some in this chamber who hold that this is not the proper chamber for this discussion, that bills affecting the Elections Act should be introduced by the elected House. To quote Senator Tanis on this point, I believe the subject matter of this bill is not one that the Senate should be initiating. It is, in my mind, disrespectful for the Senate to proactively seek change to election processes for members of Parliament. But that's my opinion. End of quote. I respect Senator Tanis, and I respect his opinion, although I do not share it. But please note that opinion does not supersede parliamentary rules, conventions, or precedent. Nothing in the rules prevents a senator from introducing a bill on any subject. The Constitution Act 1982 grants the Senate as much legislative power as the House of Commons, excluding, as we all know, money bills. Moreover, in the past 20 years, the Senate of Canada has introduced 15 bills amending the Canada Elections Act, only one of which was a government bill. One of these public bills actually passed the Senate and was referred to the next place. One of these significant Senate public bills proposed mandatory voting. This proposal was vehemently debated at second reading. One of these bills, which may prick up the ears of a few of my colleagues, was introduced by former Senator Frum and proposed to ban foreign contributions to political entities. This particular bill was referred to committee within a year of its introduction. It may interest senators to know that at no time during any of the debate on any of these election-related bills, was the objection ever raised by any senator of any political party that the Senate is the improper chamber to initiate changes to the Elections Act, until we came to my Vote 16 bills. It was mistakenly suggested by a senator last session that all parties opposed the Vote 16 bill in the House of Commons. In fact, the NDP, the Bloc, and the Green Party all voted unanimously in favor, as did more than 20 members of the governing party, bravely breaking from the whip. Together, those MPs represent over 30% of the national popular vote, over 4 million Canadians in the 2021 election. Colleagues, we are in the business of incremental change. That vote tells a different story of growing acceptance of expanding voting rights to revitalize our democracy, and clear evidence that many Canadians, perhaps especially those whose voices cannot be heard now in Parliament unless we continue to clear the way, inviting them to speak directly to senators in committee. The evidence is clear. The moment is now ours. I was deeply honored by the level of support my Vote 16 bills have received. More than 50 civil society organizations endorsed a joint statement calling to expand voting rights, including Apathy is Boring, the Association francophone des parents de Nouveau-Brunswick, BC Teachers Federation, Canadian Federation of Students, Canadian Labour Congress, Canadian Women's Foundation, Conseil Jeunesse Provinciale de la Nouvelle-Écosse, Fair Vote Canada, Fair Voting BC, Franco-Jeune de Terre-Neuve et du Labrador, Manitoba Association of Rights and Liberties, Operation Black Vote Canada, PEI Coalition for Women in Government, Samara Centre for Democracy, UNICEF Canada, and Youth Ottawa. Being free from the biases and pressures of the electoral cycle and partisanship, is not the Senate best placed to initiate the long overdue study of this important issue? By its very design, the Senate is intended to participate in the legislative process in a manner that is removed from the pressures of the electoral cycle and the partisan politics of the moment. As our esteemed Senator Harder noted in the National Journal of Constitutional Law, quote, because senators are appointed for a long term, it was expected that they would not place the interests and fate of political parties at the heart of their deliberations. Instead, senators would take an independent and disinterested approach to the task of legislative review and debate, applying their thoughtful judgment without being hampered by electoral or partisan pressures, end of quote. Freed from the pressures, constraints, and imperatives of the electoral cycle, senators may be able to bring a more nuanced distance to the reform of the voting age that may not be possible for an elected body, which must face the biases and pressures, both known and unknown, associated with their elective functions. Colleagues, let me be clear. We are not asking here for a final vote on this bill. We are asking that it be sent to committee for a thorough, substantive study. That is the proper forum to examine evidence, hear from experts and Canadians directly affected, and explore any questions or concerns senators may have. The arguments that were used in the past, mostly technical, are no longer relevant in this Parliament. There is no legal or constitutional impediment to studying this bill. The only barrier would be one we choose to create ourselves. By referring this bill to committee, we uphold the integrity of the legislative process and demonstrate trust in the Senate's unique capacity to deliberate responsibly and independently. I do very much want to convince you of the merits of studying this bill, of the appropriateness of doing so here in the Senate, and of how doing so fulfills our responsibility to speak for the voiceless and underrepresented. Further, as senators, we have a unique role on this sensitive issue precisely because we are removed from the pressures of the election cycle. Please consider these thoughts and reflections of our Senate colleagues. Former Speaker Fury reminded us on May 11, 2023, "The Senate is a chamber like no other." He said, quote, "Senators are in the distinct position of being able to resist public pressure in order to do public good. Never has this been more important than in today's world," end of quote. We are not bound by the immediate pressures of elections. We can look ahead, focus on the long term, and apply our knowledge and experience to strengthen public discourse. Senator Housakis, on April 20th, 2023, put it clearly, quote, "When this House was created, the father of Confederation, John A. Macdonald, made it clear that this body would speak for the voices that were not being adequately spoken for in the other place," end of quote. I am also reminded of words spoken by Senator Wallin, quote, "We are not required by law or the Constitution to defer to the elected House. They have rights and authorities, and so do we," end of quote. That independence carries with it a responsibility, the duty to study legislation fully. Former Senator Cotter on June 21st, 2023, perhaps said it well. Quote, "One of the advantages of a bill coming to us first, turning us, in a way, into a chamber of sober first thought, was that there was a greater degree of freedom and openness in the development of amendments to the bill, including amendments from the government itself. Even when senators oppose a bill, they understand that committee study is essential to a full and measured Senate deliberation," end of quote. To quote Senator Macdonald on April 18th, 2023, speaking on universal basic income, quote, "I know there is no support for this bill in our caucus. However, all bills deserve a chance to go to committee." Former Senator Plett, March 19th, 2024, echoed this principle, quote, "I have always said that I support legislation going to committee. I would be inconsistent and hypocritical if I tried to stop this from going to committee," end of quote. Why does committee study matter? Because public debate is often messy, and Senate committees are rigorous. Senator Wu, September 7th, 2022, alluded to this, quote, "Advocates and opponents are often debating different versions and hence talking past each other. If a Senate committee can clarify the issues, that will be a positive contribution on an important public policy issue, regardless of whether this bill is adopted," end of quote. Senator Wu was referring to universal basic income, but the same holds true for Vote 16. Sending this bill to committee would allow for expert witnesses, academics, advocates, and most importantly, young people themselves, to come and testify, enriching our understanding of this issue and informing our decision-making in profound ways. We need to hear from people on this issue. And when Canadians raise their voices, the Senate must listen. Senator Housakis, April 20th, 23, quote, "There also comes a point in time when we, as legislators, have heard such an outcry that I think we have an obligation, both constitutional and moral, to ensure those voices are heard," end of quote. Colleagues, there are Canadians who have been waiting for years to be heard on Vote 16. How will we choose to respond? This is a growing issue, and it will only grow larger. The data, the public support, and the growing weight of evidence from Canada and around the world indicate as much. It is a growing wave. It hasn't crested yet, but it will. I truly think parliamentarians and political parties have the opportunity to show national leadership and get ahead of this wave, where we can potentially direct and inform its trajectory positively, or we will likely find ourselves buried underneath it and dismissed as entrenched opponents. Young Canadians are leading this wave. In Toronto, thanks to the work of youth organizers like Sarah Mora and Alexei Tovainen, along with more than 20 civil society organizations involved in public safety, disability rights, transit, democratic reform, youth engagement, and public spaces, City Council voted in April of this year to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to take part in neighborhood polls. Through this change, Canada's largest city has ensured that more voters will cast their ballot as youth in a familiar and supportive environment. Sarah also addressed Port Hope, Ontario's town council, this past June, citing the recent breakthrough in Toronto, but also those in Montreal, Mont-Saint-Hilaire, and Vancouver, where 16 and 17-year-olds have been included in participatory budgeting initiatives. Sarah argued that, quote, by engaging young people civically early on, they are introduced to active citizenship and their civic responsibilities, thus increasing the likelihood they will remain engaged throughout adulthood, end of quote. Joined by youth advocates Pavan Guman and Sam Nadarada, who organized a petition among Port Hope's youth, they called on Council to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to serve on advisory committees like Parks, Recreation, and Culture, and the Environmental Advisory Committee. The group had spent months researching the town's decision-making processes, refining their proposal, and talking with Council staff and the Mayor. Council voted unanimously to formally refer this proposal to its advisory committee bylaw review and expand youth participation as part of this process. I couldn't agree more with the words of Councillor Todd Attridge, who said on that day, every time youth come and speak to us, I'm always impressed. And I also want to note the initiative of some of the members of my youth advisory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who organized and met with council members of our city council, and Winnipeg became one of the first cities in the world to declare itself a nuclear-free city, directly as a result of youth organizing and informing and making sure that councillors were well prepared before the vote took place. Over this past summer, the British Columbia Special Committee on Democratic and Electoral Reform held a province-wide consultation tour, hearing presentations from individuals and groups on how to enhance voter participation and democratic engagement in the province. Of the 41 presentations that included an opinion on the voting age, 93% were in favor of extending it to 16. Senator Harder has long been emphatic in his defense of the Senate as an indispensable forum for little-heard voices. Quote, the second chamber provides a voice for smaller regions and minority interests so that they are not drowned out by the larger and louder voices. Quote, and, quote, it is the function of the Senate to detect and communicate the views and opinions that the representative system in the Commons fails to detect adequately, end of quote. This point has also been made in another way by comedian Rick Mercer, and it was quoted in the House by former MP Scott Sims in support of Vote 16. Quote from Mercer, if I were 16, I would write my member of parliament. I would complain. Except if I were 16, they wouldn't care what I had to say because I don't have the vote, and that's the problem, end of quote. A committee study would allow the Senate to hear from young Canadians, weigh the evidence, and provide the sober, independent perspective this chamber is designed to offer. And finally, I recall the words of Senator Batters. Shared. I wanted to make sure I could speak it well. Shared in this chamber April 25th, 2023, during debate on another contentious bill, attested that curtailing debate on important issues, quote, runs roughshod over the very minority interests senators are sworn to protect, end of quote. And she powerfully declared that, quote, in this place, one of our roles as senators is to safeguard and preserve the rights and interests of minorities that may be overrun in a House of Commons elected by representation by population, end of quote. What was true then holds true now. Colleagues, this is precisely why a study on extending the voting age belongs here. We have the authority. We have the independence. We have the responsibility. Let us hear the evidence. Let us hear the youth. Let us provide the guidance this country deserves. Extending the voting age to include 16 and 17-year-olds is not simply about adding more names to the voters list. It is about renewing and strengthening our democratic institutions at a time when they are under real strain. Here in Canada, voter turnout has declined sharply over the last 40 years, and trust in Parliament and public institutions has weakened. Around the world, similar forces are at play: polarization, disengagement, and cynicism. The best response to these pressures is not to narrow participation, but to broaden it, to invite more Canadians into the process to show that their voices matter, and to make clear that our democracy belongs to them. And the evidence shows this works. In Austria, where 16-year-olds have been voting since 2007, turnout rates among this group are comparable to and often higher than those of older first-time voters. In Scotland's independence referendum, 16 and 17-year-olds voted at an estimated rate of 75%, outpacing those just a few years older. A more recent study in Scotland has confirmed that young people who are enfranchised at age 16 or 17 tend to vote in higher proportions, not only immediately, but also in subsequent elections on into their 20s. This brings me to one of the most compelling arguments in favor of extending voting to 16 and 17-year-olds: developing healthy democratic habits. Here in Canada, Elections Canada has consistently found that voting is habit forming. Young Canadians who vote in their first eligible election are far more likely to continue voting throughout their lives. But if they miss that first opportunity, disengagement tends to persist. Right now, our system introduces voting at a moment of disruption, when young people are often moving away from home, starting work or post-secondary study, and least rooted in their communities. By extending the vote to 16, when most are still in school and in stable environments, we give them the best possible conditions to form that lifelong habit. Far from weakening our democracy, empowering young Canadians earlier would make our democracy more resilient, more participatory, more representative, and stronger against the forces that seek to erode democracy. Research also shows a trickle-up effect. When young people engage, their parents, just a moment. I may have to wait for a little more water. The trickle-up effect, when young people engage, their parents and grandparents are more likely to re-engage as well. In other words, expanding the voting age does not just strengthen youth participation, it strengthens participation across society. As the Chief Electoral Officer for the Northwest Territories recently stated, quote, "In the jurisdictions where they have lowered the voting age, what they found is that 16 and 17-year-olds vote at a higher rate than 18 to 24-year-olds. But they're also more likely to vote in the next election and the election after that." I stand here today not in an effort to convince you of the merits of
Senator McPhedran, the time allocated for your speech has expired.
May I ask for 3 more minutes?
Is it agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you, colleagues. I appreciate it.
Senator McPhedran.
I stand here urging you to send this bill to committee so we can all learn more about the potential benefits. S-222 is not a radical proposition. 17 countries, including Scotland, Germany, and the United Kingdom, are expanding voting rights at either the national, state, or local level. We have much to learn from this experience. If the British government has the clarity to expand voting rights, surely this House can muster the curiosity to learn why. I look forward to hearing this bill's critic, Senator Mary Jane McCollum, and all other senators who wish to speak. If you're unsure about the merits of this bill, if you're undecided, and even if you're just curious, please send this bill to committee. We owe it to ourselves to learn more so we can do our job and keep our promise to Canadians to hear them. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.